The next presentation will be on the topic Developing Entrepreneurship Incubators at the University Level. And this will be done by Dr. Detlef Hallermann. Dr. Hallermann is a clinical associate professor, and he's also director of Brilliant Trading Center, director, Trading, Risk and Investment Program, Mays Business School, Department of Finance, Texas A&M University, USA. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Dr. Hallermann.
Howdy. Oh, there are no Aggies in the place then. I can always tell when there are Aggies. There's one. All right, I'll say it again then. Howdy. All right, there we go. So we got one or two Aggies in the place. I want to start off, and don't worry, these notes are up here to slow me, to stop me from speaking too long, not going the other way around. I know everybody's had a little bit of lunch, and I think I'm the last speaker before the panel. But what I'll start off with is to almost kind of start off with a confession, if you will. I'm a failure. And what I mean by that is I probably started 4 different businesses in my time before academia and during academia, and 2 of which have failed. And I think that's one of the things that in our conversations that we've had here, this is one of the points that we don't like to talk about in terms of entrepreneurship is, in the United States, 9 out of 10 businesses fail. New businesses, startups fail. And it requires a certain mentality, not just of the people that are presenting or the people that are starting businesses, but it requires a mentality of those people around them to accept the fact that they're going to fail. Going back to what Mark was saying, he's not looking for the person that may have the right business this time, but will find the right business that's willing to fail again, and then finally succeed. And that's easier said than done. And I'm going to go back to all of you that have played sports. And I've got an old saying from a coach of mine, and I remember after I broke a tennis racket after a tennis match, it was glorious. But when I did it, I broke a racket against the fence, and at that moment, my coach came up to me a few minutes afterwards, and he said, "Look, you never learn from winning because you've won. You've done everything you're supposed to do. You succeeded, but you learn from your failures." And that's a lot of what we're trying to do now with this wave of entrepreneurship is realizing or understanding that it takes a societal understanding that you don't embrace failure, but you do accept it. And part of the reason for building this Petroleum Ventures program at Texas A&M, one of the goals there was we've got a lot of young kids in this millennial age that are not used to failure. And they've got to get used to the idea that they aren't going to succeed, that they're going to take some hits. And so with that in mind, part of where we teach some of that is here in academia. So I'm going to be a little bit different today in the sense that when I'm speaking to many of you here today, I'm not speaking to the industrialists or the potential investors. I'm really speaking to the academics here. And speaking to you because the program that I'll talk about, the Petroleum Ventures program, really is a program in which we're starting this incubation, not just of, we're going to give kids an opportunity to build a business plan and come up with an idea, but to give kids the ability to start integrating the thought process of how am I going to build a team, how am I going to scale, and to do that at the university level with the assistance of the faculty. And that's probably the key thing is with the assistance of the faculty. It's real easy to have kids go into a room and come up with an idea. They do that on their own. But it's not easy to create a surge that starts at the university level. And so I'll get into that into a little bit. But when I talk about, again, the fact that I had a couple successes but a couple failures, one of my failures was due to timing. The investment happened at the wrong time. It was a good investment, but the timing was wrong. And the second one was I had the wrong partners. I had a great idea, phenomenal idea, but there's some things I couldn't do. And when I looked around after the fact, after it had blown up and it didn't work anymore, I realized I didn't have the right partners. I didn't have the right team. And so much of what we're trying to do with this Petroleum Ventures program is to focus around how do you get the right partners. And that's where we get into this idea, whoops, let me try this. Well, we're going to sit on this slide the entire time because right now we haven't figured out how to move it forward. So there we go. How about that? Okay. So, but the idea was that oftentimes when you look at entrepreneurship, the ones that succeed are beautiful, but the ones that fail, oftentimes you can look at either the fact that their timing was off, their costs weren't where they were supposed to be, or that they didn't have the right teammates to succeed, to enable them to scale up to a larger model, for them to realize when they were no longer entrepreneurial, but they were really a business. And they didn't take the steps at the right time to continue that process. And part of what we did, or what we're doing that I'll allude us to, is we've got this program that's in its first year that we think is going to address that issue of having the right people in the right team, having the right mentality walking out of it. So with that in mind, I'm going to introduce you to an old friend of mine, a gentleman by the name of Billy Pete Huddleston, and he's kind of a Texas legend, or an A&M legend. I should say A&M because there are probably two people in the front row who've never heard of him. But Billy Pete was legendary in the sense that he was a professor in the Petroleum Engineering Department for over 20 years. And he was a brilliant man, and you knew when he was going to really start his brilliance because he'd say, "I'm just a good old boy from West Texas." And that's when he would say something that was incredibly brilliant. And the things that he explained to me, first off, was he was the only professor in the entire Petroleum Engineering Department that would sit there and say, "Now, Detlef, it doesn't matter if you get another barrel of oil out of the ground if it costs you $50 to do it." And this is when oil was at $12 a barrel. And he would say, if it costs you $50 to do it, it's just not worth it. And so these are the things that we realized in 1987 when oil prices went from 40 down to 12 is it doesn't matter how well you do something if it doesn't make money doing it. And so with that in mind, Billy Pete was a man who not only taught hundreds of students, he actually paid for hundreds of students to go to A&M out of his own personal funds and whatnot else. He did a number of brilliant things, but one of the other things that he did that was critical was he talked about creative destructionism. And whenever you're an entrepreneur, we talk about the creativity side, but ultimately you're destroying something else. If you create a new business, that means there's an old business that's being replaced, or there's a void being replaced. There's something that's being replaced. If you're building the brand new app that's going to be used for travelers to be able to do your plane tickets, that means there's somebody who's not using a phone now to book your travel for you. There's something that's being destroyed. And we have to accept that fact that to be an entrepreneur, you're going to destroy something. And so oftentimes when we go to entrepreneurship and we think about entrepreneurship, there are two things that happen. Either you're destroying something or you're becoming an entrepreneur because of a cataclysmic change or event that's already occurred. And I'll give you three examples. There was a gentleman earlier that asked about the difference between entrepreneurship and creativity in post-World War I Germany versus the United States. And I don't know if that gentleman is here anymore or not, but what I can say to that is my father, having grown up in that area at that time, explained to me that you were dealing with over 100% inflation, hyperinflation during the Great Depression, and he was entrepreneurial. He basically raised chickens and sold eggs, and the reason for that was when you have no other choice, that's what you do. When there's no job, when there's no opportunity, and the only chance you have to eat that night is to go figure out a way of making money, you're going to go do it. And that's basically the setup where he was at. When I was 12 years old, he came to me and he said, "Son, I don't think we have enough money for college. You're going to have to start thinking about what you're going to do." And I started a company where I started cutting hay for other ranchers and cutting and baling hay with a tractor that I borrowed, and that's how I ended up making the money I needed for college. Those were examples. That was my first successful entrepreneurial effort, I'll say. But those were examples of entrepreneurship that happened because of a cataclysmic event. I didn't have enough money for college. My father didn't have any food to eat. A couple other examples of that, when I went back and I looked, if you go back to Enron, how many of y'all remember Enron? 2003, basically, well, okay, everybody over 40, basically. But that was a point in time where the trading sector in the energy world was blowing and going, and all of a sudden you had a tremendous impact because a particular company went under, and all of a sudden you had literally people that were millionaires one day that had their money in Enron stock that were bankrupt the next, and several friends of mine. But out of that, out of all of the unemployment, out of all of the cataclysms that occurred, I can name to you 5 friends of mine that are all Aggies that started their own hedge funds out of it. And several of these hedge funds are worth over $1 billion today. Well, not Mother Rock, they went under. Got to give credit where it's due. Mother Rock went under. Vilate is worth several $1 billion. Avant and Timonier are in the $500 to $800 million range. So these are all firms that, had Enron not collapsed, these firms would have never developed. And I can go further. I went and looked at the Aggie 100. These are the 100 most entrepreneurial firms of I think this was 2014 or 2015, and I looked at the top 30. And out of the top 30, you had 6, 7, 8 oil companies that had not been in existence 10 years ago, 10 to 15 years ago. The good news is I looked at about 3 of those, and out of those 3, they were all classmates of mine. And the reason that I point that out is I started A&M when oil was at $40 a barrel in 1985. In 1987, oil went down from $40 down to $12 a barrel. And our department head walked in, and we had 400 students in the class. And he said, I'm going to get rid of every single one of you because I don't think there will be jobs in 2 years. And our class went from 400 down to 38. Now, how many of y'all are students in here? Okay, think about your GPA real fast. We were on a GPA on a 4.0 scale where if you were below a 2.0, you were in trouble. Our department average was a 2.2. And we had 38 out of 400 starting. So that gives you an idea. There were 38 idiots that stayed in petroleum engineering that ended up getting a GPA average of a 2.2. I had 3 friends of mine and myself, and we could not add up to a 9. Okay? 4 of us. All right? But 3 of those friends are on that list there that have started their own oil companies. And the reason that I bring that up is, yes, for those of you with the 2.2, raise your hand proud, okay? But the reason that I bring this up is we got out, we didn't have jobs. We had to do something. I remember a friend of mine went to an oil company and he showed up at their doorstep at 8 a.m. every morning for 2 weeks and said, I'm here to work. And they said, we don't have anything. That's fine. I'll stay till 10 o'clock. I'll stay till noon. And after 3 days, they said, okay, we got a project for you. It'll take 3 days. He worked 3 days. Then he showed up the next Monday. I'm here to work. We don't have anything for you today. That's fine. I'll wait. After 2 weeks, they finally offered him a job because it took that type of resilience of, you keep telling me no, but I'm going to stay here until you don't tell me no, for the people for him to get that job and to get that offer. He's on that list now. And I bring that up again and again because I think, honestly, part of being an entrepreneur is knowing when you don't have the skills you need, but also not knowing when to say no. And it's a delicate balance, and Mark brought that up in the sense that he talked about, if you've got a bad idea, we want you to fail miserably fast so that you move on. So out of this, I've talked about the firms that were created out of this, but there's also the fact that there was an industry that was created out of this. And what I mean by this is, in the late 80s, there were no venture capital or private equity groups that were funding people to start oil companies. And now I have on the board 3 of a list of probably 15 or 20 companies that exclusively raise funds to produce venture capital. And that would not have happened had we not had the fall in oil prices in the late 80s, had we not had prices go from 40 down to 12. Because when that happened, basically the majors started selling off assets that they would have never sold off anyway. And engineers started looking around saying, hey, I can buy the company that I'm working for. I can buy the field that I'm working at because they're about to lay me off. I need to do something. So they scrapped up money and they were able to buy bits and pieces here and there, and they buy one, they pay off the debt. They buy another one, they pay off the debt. Buy a third, pay off the debt. And they kept growing and building these companies until they were acquired. And then they would start another company off the proceeds, off the profits. And they go through this cycle over and over again, building up an asset, selling it off, building up an asset, selling it off, improving it, selling it off. And the reason that I bring this up is a lot of entrepreneurial things that we talk about, they're sexy, they're glamorous. I've got a new app, I've got a new program, I've got a new technology. But sometimes it's just taking what you have and making it better, taking what somebody else did and being more efficient, making it more profitable. And smaller companies can do that. People that start these smaller companies can do it. There are funds available for that sort of advancement as well. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the founders of PVP, and I'm going to try to keep this short because we've had a lot of presentations. I'm sure people here are getting a little bit tired, but here are 2 buddies of mine, Jay and Anthony. And what's more important is not the picture of Jay and Anthony, nor the picture of the horses. They started Wild Horse Resources, and I'm going to say they started it 3 times because they started with private equity. Jay was getting ready to get laid off. He was operating a field. He was the head engineer. Basically, the story goes back to Mr. Huddleston. He and Anthony, Jay found out he was about to get laid off. They were going to sell the field. He and his partner, Anthony, went over to Mr. Huddleston and said, hey, we quit our jobs. We're about to get laid off. We want to go buy this field. Mr. Huddleston chastised them appropriately, and then he sent them over to one of the private equity groups. And they didn't get funding. And then they went back to Mr. Huddleston and said, well, we didn't get the money. What do we do now? And the story is that Mr. Huddleston basically wrote a letter and sealed it in an envelope and said, bring this back over to the private equity group. And the private, they had another meeting with the private equity group, and the private equity group opened up the letter, and they looked at the letter, and they said, okay, we'll fund you $500 million. Now, that's a great story, and that's a hell of a letter on the envelope. What the letter said was, I will fund 5% of what you give them. And basically what they had was the right person, because so much of investing is not what you have, but who you know. And so often, and I'm going to go back to what Mark was saying, so often they want to know this entrepreneur in the first, second, and third event when the person fails, because that one time when they get it right, they're there ready to invest, and they have the relationship and the history with the entrepreneur. It's more about the relationship and the history. I was speaking with someone earlier today at lunch, and they were saying, the question is, I go to my family or I go to somebody and I say, invest in me. And they say, why should I invest in you when I can put that money in land? Why should I put that money in you when I can put it in this investment over here? And the answer is because you know me. Because you know who I am, you know what I'm capable of. And so much of what we're doing in this incubator is creating opportunities for investors to learn who the students are and what they're capable of. It's about the relationships. Ultimately, it's not about the gadget. It's about knowing that the person you're putting your money with is going to be there, is going to perform, is going to do what they say they're able to do, and is going to be able to come back to you when you need help and say, I need help, I don't have the skills, and I need a partner. Or I need support. So that I can steward your finances appropriately, your investment appropriately. So much of this, for you young entrepreneurs, I'm speaking to you now, so much of this is about your integrity. It's about your word, it's about your honor, and if you don't have those things, they'll never give you money. Because if you don't have those things, why should they entrust their hard work for money with you? And so this is where we were going with the Petroleum Ventures program. We needed to have a way of getting the right people together and getting the right relationships to be established early on. And so Jay and Anthony came to the university, and they basically said, look, the hard problem we have is we have petroleum engineering students that want to start businesses, that want to go take business classes. We have business students that are going to go into investment banking, they're going to go into private equity, they're going to go into all of these areas of financing and funding, and they don't understand the petroleum industry. And each side said, look, we have so many students in our own major, we have no time for the other majors over there. Us engineers need to take care of us engineers, us business majors need to take care of us business majors. And they said, fine, how much money will it take to make extra sections, to have extra classes of all the things that we want to have? And the university came up with a number. It turned out to be $12 million. And they endowed half the petroleum engineering department, half the business school, with $6 million each, so that way each department could create the additional classes to put those petroleum engineering students into business classes and to put those business students into the petroleum engineering classes. And the reason for that wasn't just so a petroleum engineering student could learn about finance or a finance student could understand petroleum engineering. It was the cross-pollination of the petroleum engineering students working with the finance students and the finance students working with the petroleum engineering students. So that 10 years from now, when that petroleum engineer is sitting there saying, I've got the perfect field to go by, I've got the technical expertise, I've got the ability that I can run this field 15% more efficiently, instead of them having to then go figure out how to negotiate terms, how to incorporate a company, how to find the right attorney, they've already got that. They went to school with that individual 10 years ago. And they established that relationship with that finance major who happens to be now working at Barclays or who happens to now be working at Natural Gas Partners, who happens to now have the skill set that this person needs. And because they've done late night study sessions together, where they've done all night sessions to get their homework in together, because they've each taught each other what they didn't understand in terms of prerequisites, they have a bonding and a relationship where they can trust each other. And those students, one petroleum engineer, one finance major, are going to have the partnership that they have both sides of what's needed to create a business. And they're going to have the relationships, that finance major is going to have the relationships on the business side in terms of legal, in terms of marketing, in terms of accounting. Am I almost out of time? I'll make it fast. Whereas at the same time, the engineer is going to have the technical skills. And I'll add one more conduit to this. We've also got a list of about, not a list, but we have 25 members of a company, of our advisory board, that are already in private equity, that are already in investment banking, that are founders of companies that have already done this. So the students aren't just cross-pollinating with each other. They're getting that mentorship with people that are already involved, and they're establishing those relationships with people that 10 years from now will be able to write down on an envelope or on a note, I'll take 5%, and put that in an envelope to send over to the next private equity person. And so I bring this up just to, again, we won't have time to go through it. Here's basically the coursework. The idea is we put finance majors in upper level petroleum engineering. We put petroleum engineering majors in upper level finance. We enable these students to create the relationships with each other and the relationships with the advisory board so that, again, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, after they've gotten their experience, they're ready to start their first company when they're in their 30s as opposed to doing it in their 40s and their 50s. I know I've gone long in time, so I thank you for your time. I'll be happy to answer any questions. Yes, sir. I guess we have the mic coming. You can yell or you can wait for the mic, either way. Absolutely.
Does a petroleum engineering or petroleum energy incubator look different from other incubators?
I think it looks a little bit different in the sense that most, in this sense, a petroleum engineering incubator is one to develop exploration and production companies. Mm-hmm. And so oftentimes you're looking at somebody who has a technical skill, but the amount of money that's going to be needed could be substantially larger. So if I'm going to start an oil and gas company, I'm probably buying a field that's in existence, or I'm developing a new downhole tool that I built a prototype out of, and I'm going to have to go to a service company to get funding, or I'm going to have to go to somebody to get funding. So I would argue the initial funding is going to typically be larger. I may need $15, $20 million for this small field of 10 wells. I may need much more than that for a field of 25 wells.
Yeah, and from a structural perspective, does it make difference?
I think, as Mark said, if it's a good investment and the firms can see, the investors can see it's a good investment, I don't think anything else changes. The dollar number is bigger. You probably need to have a little bit more infrastructure in terms of human resources or management or accounting and legal, because you're acquiring an asset to begin with versus starting something from scratch, a brand new technology.
In the United States, the energy industry and the petroleum energy industry is largely private.
Yes.
Whereas in Saudi it is almost 100% governmental.
Yes.
Does it make a difference when it comes to developing entrepreneurship programs?
I don't think so, and here's where I differentiate. If you go to the service sector, that's private, and what I mean by that is we're not talking just about the Schlumberger or the Halliburton, but the company that's providing the trucking for the drilling rigs, the company that is providing that's doing the power spraying to clean the rigs in the facilities, the company that is building the valves for the pipelines, those are all private and those aren't government owned. And those are companies that can be built and grown and developed just as easily as an E&P company. An E&P support company can be developed the same way, if that makes sense. So one of the people that I enjoy most, he's probably one of the biggest supporters of the A&M football team, is a guy that started his own valve company, and he created a very good valve, and he had an idea. He got funded by a pipe company, and they partnered with him. Later on, he bought them out, but basically he owns his own valve company. And the best part about it is he lets our football coach use his helicopter to go look at recruits. So we love him for that. But the point there is he's had a very successful career based off of one valve design. So
thank you.
Yes.
Here.
Yes, sir.
Hello. My question is, due to the recent oil crisis, first of all, how did your initial startup, the startup that were already existing, how did they survive the crisis? Second of all, how did you convince more startups? Yes, come, the oil will go, the price will go up again, the market will survive, it will find its balance again. How did they still come to invest in this market?
Right. So to answer your question, we had 38 students that finished in my class. Out of those 38, I'd say a quarter are not in the industry anymore. We went areas outside of the industry. I'd say about 15 out of those are working for an oil company. They've been laid off. They had to eat a lot of top ramen soup or a lot of bread, and then someday they got another job again, and they were able to recover. And then we have the group, probably about 10 or so, that started new businesses. And they, I'd argue that everybody in that class has been successful to one degree or another. But it really goes back to your passion. And I'm going to say something that I'll say about anything is, if you're not passionate about the work that you're doing, go find the work that you are going to be passionate about, because you won't do a good job with the work that you have if you're not passionate about it, if you're not excited about it. And I think that's part of what happened is, I wanted to be a petroleum engineer. I couldn't be a petroleum engineer. I ended up going into markets and trading as a result of that, and then came back to the university to build this specifically because I felt like it was my obligation to do so. I will say to that end, to your question, is some people will find that it's too difficult to be an entrepreneur. They won't have that willingness to go through the hard times to get to the other side, if that makes sense. Some people will have that willingness, but they're incapable of making it to the other side. And they'll have to, at some point in time, give up just because of the futility. There will be some that will make it across to the other side. Out of the almost 40 that graduated out of my class, only a quarter started companies. Out of the 400 that started as petroleum engineers, only 10 actually started a company. So to answer your question, I think what's most important is find what you're passionate about, and you won't mind going hungry to fulfill that dream. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, hello. You suggest that focusing on relationships is as important or more important than focusing on the information that you get in the class, or for example, in anywhere.
Yes, and I'll stand by that. The people that you build your businesses with are people you have to be able to trust, that you have to be able to know their limits and they have to know your limits. You're going to be spending, if you're starting a new business, you're basically married to that individual. And what I mean by that is you will spend more time with that individual than you will with your spouse if you're married. Okay? I'll give you an example. I was working with a friend of mine on a medical products company that we were taking, not public, but we were taking to financing. This is a little over a year ago. And we had worked about 1.5 years nonstop. I was basically working 40 hours a week at the university and 60 hours a week at home on this project for almost a full year with my partner. And we were at the point where we actually had 3 firms that were negotiating with us on financial terms. And we were 6 months away from starting production. I was going to leave the university at that point. And the researchers who were responsible for the product came back to us and said, well, actually, it's not going to be ready in 6 months. It's going to be ready in 18 months. And we said, well, how long have you known about this? And they said, about 4 months. Well, why didn't you tell us this while we were actually going through and talking with these investors? Well, we didn't think it was relevant. And our response was pretty clipped. But once we realized what had happened, we actually pulled ourselves completely out of the investment, my partner and I. And we went to the people that we were negotiating with. We explained the situation. We said, ethically, we don't feel comfortable either continuing with this relationship. And my partner and I had to sit there and realize that we had invested 1 year to 1.5 years on an investment, on a project that was going to be, the investment money we were asking for was close to $20 million. So you can imagine this was going to be a significant company. But when we looked at who we had providing us the research, we realized we did not have the right teammates. And that's why we decided to step away. My partner and I will probably do another company at some point again soon. But without the right players, without your right partners, without the right level of integrity, you can't go forward. And this is why we want these students to relate to each other and get to know each other when they're juniors and seniors in college, not trying to figure that out when they're 35. Does that make sense? Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. All right, well, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation.